Ready to go? Get your coffee, have a seat. I'm James Cross. I'm the founder of the Silicon Valley Defense Group. And I'll just state right up front that the tone of the conversation is about to shift, because what I've learned in my 10 years of being a venture capitalist is VCs and startup founders are cheeky, sassy. They got a lot of opinions. You can't keep them on script. So
opinions?
All right, I'm just trying to. I'm doing a little damage control up front, Delian. Anyway, happy to be here to chat with y'all. Thanks to Congressman Banks for having us out. Very excited to have this conversation. I think it's vitally important to national security. We started Silicon Valley Defense Group back in 2015 as a nonprofit out of a conversation with Senator McCain. Found myself sitting in his office on his couch. Had been introduced by a friend. I didn't know why I was there. And the first thing he said is that DoD needs to work better with Silicon Valley. So I said, well, sir, I'm a defense investor. I'm based in Silicon Valley. I'd love to help. So I accidentally volunteered on the spot. And he said, well, work with my guy, Bill here. Bill Greenwald was a staffer on the Senate Armed Services Committee at the time. And we just started pulling together thought leaders from tech and finance to help the policymaker community understand how our world worked and vice versa. So ran that informally for about 5 years and then got some funding from some great sponsors like I know Anduril's here. Thanks, Palmer. Raytheon's a sponsor. I imagine there's some Lockheed folks as well. We've got Microsoft, Google, Amazon, some family offices and whatnot. So staffed up now in DC and the West Coast to more formally pursue this mission. So our mission is to develop an enduring advantage in a techno-security competition that we've got kind of with China and our adversaries, and just support the idea that democracy needs to win this multi-decade competition. So that's kind of who we are and what we do. Just for full disclosure, for my day job, I run the venture team at Franklin Templeton, and I may or may not be invested in several of the companies up here on the stage and in the audience. So we'll get that out of the way. So why don't you guys go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we'll jump into the conversation.
Cool. Yeah, nice to meet you all. I'm Delian. Thank you again, Congressman Banks, for having us and putting together, sort of a panel like this. I think there's not that many people in Congress that really, engage with Silicon Valley the way that Congressman Banks does. My name is Delian. I'm a partner at Founders Fund, which is a preeminent venture capital firm in Silicon Valley, originally co-founded by Peter Thiel back in 2004. We have a pretty long and storied history of working with the defense community. Peter originally incubated Palantir, which many of you are probably familiar with, within the venture firm. We were also one of the major investors of SpaceX in the very early days, 2008, 2009. And then you'll hear from Palmer later today, but Anduril, his company, was also incubated within Founders Fund. And so in 2020, 2019, I had this particular sort of idea and passion around microgravity manufacturing that I originally pursued as an investment thesis, tried to basically look at were there any companies out there on the market, and ultimately came to the conclusion that there wasn't anybody that warranted investing. And so in summer 2020, decided to co-found and incubate within the venture capital firm and start Varda Space Industries. So we're about 2.5 years from that moment. And today, actually above us, about 400 miles or so, there's the world's first microgravity pharmaceutical manufacturing satellite. So think of something that is effectively the size of a Starlink satellite, but rather than on board having a really large internet radio, we basically instead have pharmaceuticals on board that we work with top 20 biopharma, think groups like Merck, Eli Lilly, Bristol Myers Squibb. We basically perform pharmaceutical manufacturing for them inside of that satellite, and then we put that inside of a reentry pod, bring those basically drugs back down to Earth. We land in the Utah Test and Training Range, and we actually partner with the DoD because during that reentry process, when we're bringing those drugs back, we transit through a very similar regime as the boost glide hypersonic vehicle regime. And so the DoD uses this effectively as, think of it as like a next generation, sort of test bed, where if the Wright brothers or 747s are tested in wind tunnels on the ground, the DoD wants to be testing their hypersonic systems in a net similar environment to what they're going to see. And so our reentry vehicle is effectively that next generation wind tunnel. So we've also partnered with groups like Purdue. Our entire hypersonics team are all Purdue PhDs. We come out here relatively often to use their various sort of testing facilities, and then we're also partnered with Navy Crane and on contract there, so that's public, so I think I'm allowed to say that. But yeah, excited to join here today and tell you guys a little bit about my life as both a venture capitalist that invests in defense companies, kind of similar to James, but also somebody who's gotten to take a company from scratch to only 2 years in having $60 million of programs with the Air Force and the Navy. And so, we had a conversation with Representative Gallagher last night, and he was like, the topic of your guys' panel is yet again going to be, bridging the gap between the defense industry and Silicon Valley. And I think I can finally say, Representative Gallagher, I think we've bridged the gap. Let's just make it a little stronger bridge.
Good morning. My name is Shey Sabripour. I'm the founder and CEO of a company in Austin, Texas called Cesium Astro. My background is I'm an electrical engineer. Right out of school, I started working for a company called Lockheed Martin, space systems company. I was there for 24 years, designing and building large geostationary satellites for both commercial and military applications. After Lockheed Martin, I was the chief technical officer for a small rocket company in Austin, Texas. And I started my company in January of 2017 with the motivation that as a young engineer, I noticed when I started at Lockheed, which is a great company, it was an amazing company, that a lot of our satellites were quite large, quite expensive, especially the military ones. I think you may have heard a few years ago, General Hyten mentioned that I'm not investing in these large behemoth gold-plated satellites anymore. Those are the kinds that I worked on. One of the things I noticed as a young engineer was that some of these satellites are designed to last 12, 15, 18, 20 years. Sometimes they last longer, to 30 years. And the design cycle for these satellites are sometimes 5 to 10 years. And the chips that went into them, obviously, were not invented yesterday, so the chips are also 5 years behind that. So sometimes I felt that we have assets in orbit that serve the warfighter and that are 40 years old, 40, technologies that are 40 years old. And that was kind of odd to me. My son is never happy with like iPhone 13. He has to have the iPhone, 14. But yet our warfighters are using technologies that sometimes are 30 to 40 years old. I thought there's a better way in advancing the technology for our satellites. So I started my company to build technologies in this particular space communications technology called using active phased array technologies called AESAs. Like I said, the company started in 2017. We've grown to, it's a venture-backed company. We've grown to 140 people now, headquartered in Austin, offices in Broomfield, Colorado, El Segundo, and we just acquired a small company north of London as well. And our goal is to really commoditize space communication, whether it's in low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, or geostationary orbit. And happy to talk to you more about it.
Yeah, the age of the technology is interesting. On the drive over here with my buddy Adam from Anduril, we were talking about how old the Sidewinder missile is, and of course, Anduril wants to do something about that with their recent acquisition into the solid munitions motors business. So we'll see what happens there. I think one of the funnest things for me personally about being a venture capitalist is meeting amazing founders and getting their founder stories. And I always, the first time I meet a founder, that's the first thing I want to do is like, why did you start this? Where are you trying to go? And what are you trying to do? Why? Like personally, like, so I'd love to ask you guys kind of real quick, like the first 10 minutes or 5 minutes of our meeting, we're in our due diligence process or just getting to meet you guys. So what catalyzed you to quit your day job or change your career path? So 3 things. 1, what was the catalyst? 2, what was the biggest unexpected challenge you've had to overcome now? And then 3, what are you most proud of where your company's at today?
So I'd actually been thinking about microgravity manufacturing since I was in high school. It was funny when I started.
It's because you're kind of a weirdo, but anyway, go ahead.
No comment. When I started the company, it was funny. I had like a buddy from 10th grade, hit me up and he's like, "Hey, you finally started that company that you pitched me on." I was like, "Damn, I really have been thinking about this for a while." Part of why I got really excited about it was in some ways, if you study all of human history and you look at any time that humanity has like consistently settled or explored anywhere, it has only come through not very large merchant ships, but it's come through economic, basically, activity that happens, right? Whether it's the sort of United States colonies, or if you look at in the 1400s, the Portuguese versus the Chinese Empire. Chinese Empire builds a huge fleet. They like bring elephants back from Africa, but they like establish no trading posts, and their entire navy goes away. The Portuguese instead fly a bunch of navigate a bunch of sort of small merchant ships, set up trading posts all along the way, and then ultimately the Portuguese Empire has a massive navy. And so I always thought that sort of same analogy applied to space, where it's like it's really exciting that folks like Elon are working on really large rockets, but ultimately like you're not going to have a lunar base or eventually like a city on Mars unless there's actual sort of economic activity happening there. And I thought it was something that wasn't particularly focused on. Right now, if you look in space, basically up until effectively, in my opinion, last 2 Mondays ago when we launched our first satellite, up until then, the only ways that you could basically make money in space was either communicating with space, or communicating with the Earth, things like Starlink, or taking photos of the Earth, things like Planet Labs. It's basically it. Everything else is effectively a rounding error. None of those really use cases ever really require having humans on board, right? If anything, if you're building a large communication constellation, you don't want humans, there whatsoever. But I thought the clear sort of next step in terms of like the economic activity in space was going to be the manufacturing of goods in space. So I don't know how many of you know this, but even today, the NASA administrator Bob Nelson in 1982 was on a space shuttle mission and actually was doing early studies of basically how proteins would crystallize in space. And so a ton of proof points basically over the last 40 years. But then finally in 2019, despite thinking about this idea for a decade and knowing that it wasn't quite time to work on it, in 2019, one of Elon Musk's rockets launched and landed for the first time 4 times in a row. And I was like, okay, this business model finally makes sense. This is going to be the business model that propels humanity to being a multiplanetary species, because once you set up that initial sort of low Earth orbit trading post, then you can set up the trading post on the moon, then you can set up the trading post on Mars, and having that type of economic activity that actually requires humans on board, because you can send up a bunch of Starlink satellites, no humans on board, but one day when you're doing like large-scale pharmaceutical manufacturing, as much as you can automate it in the early days, even the best pharmaceutical equipment down here terrestrially that is fully automated still requires a human to come in and maintain it every 6 or 9 months. And so in Q4 19, Elon launches and lands this rocket for the first time 4 times in a row, and I was like, holy shit, now is the moment where these like economics actually pencil out. Again, I talked to everybody, realized there wasn't really anybody working on it, and I had this huge disappointing moment, and particularly when COVID hit, I was kind of depressed, as I imagine many of us were for the first month. I was like, God damn, I'm both stuck in my room playing video games for the next month, and microgravity manufacturing still isn't happening. So I was like, okay, pick myself up by my bootstraps after a month, and I was like, I just got to go do this thing myself. And thank God I work at a venture capital firm that likes, incubating sort of crazy ideas. So that was definitely, sort of the catalyst for it. I'd say like one of the hardest things to date has been just like the sort of number of people that we need to get approval for to do the damn thing. Like I always joke, I think there are more 3-letter agencies involved in Varda than like any other company, right? Because like I'm not only going to space, so that requires FAA approval. I'm communicating in space and have a camera on board, so I need FCC and NOAA approval. I then am making drugs in space, which like good luck fucking explaining that to the FDA. And then I got to re-enter, and I got to get FAA approval. And I'll give a funny comment to it, which is like, look, I love regulators. We got to keep United States citizens safe and everything. But it has taken longer. I currently do not have a license to re-enter my re-entry vehicle that is flying at 14,000 meters per second, 400 miles above us, even though it's up there. So it has taken me longer to get my FAA Part 450 re-entry license than it has to start a company, raise $140 million, get a $60 million contract from the Air Force, build the damn re-entry vehicle, build the spacecraft, launch it on a Falcon 9 rocket, and it's currently flying, and I'm still waiting on FAA approval. And by the way, we emailed the FAA 12 hours after incorporating the company, because we knew that this was going to be basically like the longest, sort of tail. So it was, okay, Catalyst.
Catalyst challenge, and what are you most proud of?
Oh, what am I most proud of?
And I bet Indiana would be happy to let you land the factory.
Yeah, if you guys want to build Congressman Banks, if
Yeah.
you can figure out how to make it so that there's a landing spaceport here, I would love to land a damn re-entry vehicle here. So please, dear God. But I think proudest, in the very beginning of the company, we basically told our investors we're going to be launching our spacecraft in June 2023. And I think a lot of investors at the time were like, haha, we've heard plenty of flight schedules from plenty of aerospace companies. But ultimately, the cultural value at Varda is the trains take off on time. We even had key vendors and key suppliers in like November, December last year say there's zero chance we are not going to be ready in June 2023. We were like, great to hear. We have 10 of our engineers standing outside of your facility, and we are ready to come inside and make sure that we're landing in June 2023. So very proud of that. Maybe the other one, a little bit more on a personal note, which is on the very first date with my girlfriend, now wife, I told her, as I told many first dates, that that she had to expect that as a part of, if she wanted to date me long term, that I would eventually go to space for work. And at the time, this was before Varda, she said, haha, very cute. Lots of San Francisco tech geeks tell me that they want to go to space. And I think I'm proud to say that at least now that I've started the company, raised $140 million, we have vehicles flying, she has now recognized that it is a little bit more likely to come to fruition. So she started to do some centrifuge G training. So I'm proud of my wife for recognizing that one day she will have to go to space with me.
Didn't expect a love story. Shey, I know from talking to you over the years, you've got some pretty strong views on where the space technology industry needs to go and how the architectures need to change and the costs and curves need to come down. So I'd love to hear, moving from one of the leading space companies, probably on the leading edge of space technology, going through your journey to start up Cesium Astro. So what was the catalyst for that? Maybe it was a belief for a moment. And then what was the biggest challenge and what are you most proud of?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned, I look at three major areas of technology that have been interesting to me for well over a couple of decades. One is, you can think of them as the three circles that I connect the dots. One of them is, in general, obviously we need energy technologies. Energy, whether it's sustainable or traditional energy sources, clean water, food, these technologies that sustain life. The other circle is advanced compute, edge computing, advanced technologies and computer technologies, and now AI, which will be game-changing, hopefully with some regulation. It'll be game-changing for the world. And the third bullet that really motivated me to start a company was communication. I always believed that unlike compute technologies, which we all feel that is really grown really rapidly and it's distributed and it's really advanced. I just didn't think a few years ago that telecommunication technology had advanced as much. It's still very stovepiped. It's still not where it needs to be. And I feel over the next decade or two, we'll see dramatic changes in telecommunication. I think that what matters is that packets of information should go from one side of the earth to the other, whether it's for commercial or government, in the least resistance, lowest entropy mode possible, regardless of what channel they're taking. As long as they're resilient, they're secure, you shouldn't have to go through Verizon or some other stovepipe systems. I think the day will come where everything, all machines, all humans, will be connected in a different way. And I got motivated by this because to this day, the electromagnetic waves, radio frequency signals, are the best way to communicate between devices and platforms and people. I mean, I think lasers are okay, fiber optics are okay, but you kind of cannot point lasers at moving cars or point lasers at your cell phones. I think the electromagnetic spectrum is a good way to provide ubiquitous communication. And the one technology that is core to all of this that we will see, and we're already seeing it from 4G long-term evolution beyond to 5G and hopefully 6G over the next decade, we'll all use a technology called phased array technologies. And I was so very passionate about this. I started pushing Lockheed to invest in it. The technology's been around for well over 100 years now. We were using it in the nose cones of F-22s and F-16s and F-35s. We were using it in Aegis ships. And I wondered why we're not using it in space and other kind of platforms. So I started pushing the company to invest in it. We did invest in it at Lockheed, flew one of the first commercial phased arrays in early 2000s. But still, the motivation wasn't there. You know, we were building these large satellites. And my my path was that I wanted to create, how was Lockheed created? How was Raytheon created? How was Honeywell created? I wanted to see if I can build a great American company. And I wanted to build it based on these picks and shovels way of raising money. It's always sexier to say that I'm going to build a constellation of satellites or build a rocket. It's not as exciting to say I'm going to build these widgets, but I felt that these widgets are really important, and I built a company around it. It is growing, and so I hope that it can grow more. And I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, I mean,
but,
we don't. I wish we had more time, but when Shey says he wants to start a great American company, I want to a little bit of your bio here, if you don't mind. He came from Iran, right?
Yes.
As a teenager by himself, and kind of was, I think, delivering newspapers in Minnesota or something to pay the bills. And so, I mean, classic immigrant comes to America for bigger opportunity. If you corner him over there, get the whole story. It's fucking incredible, and it's very inspirational to me personally. So I love that you dropped that in there. But defense tech, dual use, hardware startups are super hard. What's been the hardest thing so far?
It is hard. I mean, initially it was, fundraising, obviously. I remember when I started my company, I just Googled a list of all VCs, venture capital company in the country, and there's a Wikipedia page, there's about 120 of them. And I started cold calling them, writing emails. And, I think I had to go through probably 100 of them until I think I got one invite to a phone call. So it was hard, but I think the hardest part has been getting talent. I can tell you, going from, one person in January of 2017, I met a couple of guys from the rocket company. It wasn't my company. I was working for this rocket company. I met him at a restaurant. I told him that if you start working for me this afternoon, I'll start paying you. And we worked out of that restaurant coffee shop for about 3 months. I think the waiters and waitresses knew us. We went there for, it was a coffee shop and a restaurant, so we went there for coffee in the morning, lunch, and dinner, and did a lot of interviews, hired some people. But the biggest challenge has been acquisition of talent, which is, I think, one of our biggest challenges right now in this country. We need to really produce more engineers, more scientists, more STEM. I can tell you, out of the 140 employees that I have, I know exactly where I was and where I stood when I was trying to talk somebody to come to work for me in the company. That's really been the biggest challenge. Of course, there's other challenges for startups. My company wouldn't exist were it not for SBIRs. I think that's just something great. A program that we have allows companies like ours to actually build a minimum viable product, get it in the hands of our customers, and get some traction. The next challenge, of course, is to cross the valley of death. Hopefully we have sort of crossed it right now, but to get on a program of record and start working for programs that are actually real national security programs, and that's where we are. But those are the challenges. Really, to me, to this day, even with this macroeconomic conditions, access to capital is still there. Investors such as yourself, obviously in full disclosure, James is one of the investors of my company, along with many others, L3 Harris.
Some of the folks in the room are on your cap table, right?
Some of the folks in the room, Kleiner Perkins. And one of the biggest challenges still is acquisition to talent, of talent, and finding the right people. And we've been expanding for that reason. Post-COVID, we're now building offices where the talent is. Again, I want to thank Congressman Banks for inviting us for this amazing event. When I was driving around, actually, when I got here, I thought, wow, what a great place this area is. I actually want to look into perhaps opening offices in the Midwest. it is really, really competitive in Austin. When I moved to Austin about 13 years ago, I think the population of greater Austin area was 850,000 people. Now, 10 years later or 13 years later, it's 2.2 million people. And every major company, tech company, has a headquarters there. So I actually want to think about moving some offices, some design centers, some manufacturing in the Midwest. Because as one of the speakers said earlier, I think it's a great place to live. I think you can have good lifestyle. And hopefully people who are already here want to stay here. And so I think that's the next step for me.
Yeah. Why don't we do a little Q&A, so maybe get the mic going around. I'd love to continue that conversation as we pivot to, I think both of your companies are positive case studies that non-traditional venture-backed companies can win in the defense market. And we talk a lot about the Valley of Death, but as maybe get a couple questions going, like one reason it worked for you, for each company.
Yeah, I admit that, for us, we in some ways stumbled into it. So Varda's story, with the DoD begins summer 2021. It was about 6 months into the company's life. We basically knew that we had to build this, reentry capsule to bring the drugs back, and so we reached out to, some groups at NASA to basically help us out with the heat shield, transfer some materials over. And in the midst of that conversation, they were like, "Hey, you should actually talk to this group, within the Air Force. The reentry vehicle that you're describing looks effectively identical to theirs. Maybe there's some, sort of notes you can trade." And so we meet that group within the Air Force, sort of about a month or two, sort of later, learn that it turns out their capsule looks identical to ours. Now it was a, sort of classified program, so we couldn't quite figure out why they were building this, sort of reentry capsule or what use case it was for. But we decided to, sort of collaborate with that group, sort of more and more, and did an initial SBIR, sort of with that program. And then I think it was approximately like October 11th, 2021, the Financial Times declassifies that in summer of 2021, China had flown the first ever boost glide hypersonic missile, and they had successfully deorbited and hit, according to the Chinese, relatively close to their target. And I remember I was in the office that day, and I just remember walking around in the room and being like, you guys are going to hear from Palmer later, but they, and Earl had their border wall moment, and it became a very, sort of important national, issue for the former president. And I, kind of told the team, I was like, look, if Earl had their border wall moment, like, this is our moment. We're building a reentry capsule. We're already like, 9-10 months into building it. It's going to fly pretty damn soon. It's going to fly way before any other small-scale reentry capsule flies, given the pace that we operate at. And this is clearly now no longer just a side project for the Air Force. This is like a national security priority. And so I told the team, I was like, ditch everything else that you're doing, like for the next, sort of year and a half until we figure out how to, sort of close this contract. We're going to be a hypersonics, company. And lo and behold, that initial group that we actually got in touch with summer of 2021 ultimately ended up effectively being our primary sponsors for our AFWorks StratFi program, where we were awarded basically the full amount, $60 million, so $15 million from our end customers, $15 million from the StratFi program, and $30 million of our own private venture capital dollars. And as Shey said, I think it's a lot of the difficulty of building these types of companies is bridging that valley of death to a program of record. We're not quite there yet, but I would argue I think it's gotten a lot easier to sort of bridge that valley of death now that you can get that sizable of a program even as a venture capital, sort of non-traditional company. And that, sort of program is what ultimately allowed us to then go to private venture capitalists and show, hey, not only do we have a demand from the commercial pharmaceutical companies, but we can offset a lot of our NRE and collaborate with the DoD, and that's ultimately what allows us to raise, $150 million in the first, 18 months of the company's, life. And that type of thing just would not be possible, 4 or 5 years ago. I always like to joke that, a decade, 13 years ago, if you wanted to work with the DoD, you had to be a billionaire, Peter or Elon Musk, and you had to sue the DoD in order to work with it. So not exactly the easiest process. Then fast forward, 2016. Then you just had to be a billionaire, so you had to be Palmer Luckey to start a great defense company. You didn't have to sue the DoD anymore. And now I'd like to argue that in 2020, in order to start a really great venture-backed defense company, you no longer have to be a billionaire that sues the DoD. You no longer have to be a billionaire. You just got to be friends with a billionaire. And so it's really exciting to see that progress. And
then the next phase would be, I know you and you know Palmer. So you just have to know somebody who knows.
Exactly.
Yeah,
so soon it'll be friends of friends.
It'll be like $10 to break in, not $1 billion. So Shey, what was I mean, you've had tremendous success over the last 12 months, just racking up orders, and it feels like you're really getting traction. What's the one thing that you think really helped you break through with the defense customers?
Yeah, I think one of the decisions we made was to spend our VC money wisely. As I said earlier, my strategy was I'm a satellite guy, I'm a spacecraft guy. I wanted to build satellites, and I wanted to build different kind of satellites. I wanted to commoditize satellites. These satellites shouldn't have to be billion-dollar investments. They grew large. Shortly after, in 1957, shortly after Sputnik was launched, in fact, the division of Lockheed Martin that I worked for was tasked. The story is that President Eisenhower called David Sarnoff of RCA and said, we need to get some stuff in space. That's a division that I worked for when I was a young engineer. And the satellites started small, and they grew larger and larger because rockets were large, and you wanted to fill the entire payload fairing to capacity. And if you're going to launch a multi-$100 million or $1 billion satellite, it better be bulletproof, it better be redundant. So we added more and more redundancy to every system. Every subsystem, every system in a spacecraft, in a satellite, is redundant. So you're pretty much flying 2 or 3 satellites within one satellite. I wanted to change the paradigm, make these satellites smaller, commoditize them, have this software-defined payload on them. So you have maybe 2 or 3 small satellites. Again, it doesn't matter if it's LEO, MEO, or GEO. And then have these software-defined payloads on them so that our customers can choose and make the sail faster to our customer. Enable our, what matters is the mission, not building this awe-inspiring satellite. So I wanted to focus on that and build a company around it.
It feels like the Space Development Agency and their vision is now matching yours.
It is.
With smaller, faster, more replaceable, sooner, software defined. So it sounds like both of you guys being in the right place at the right time, aligning with a new mission need, and they've got traditional sources of supply, and now we've got new non-traditional sources of supply. And one of the goals of SVDG is that traditional, non-traditional, just difference goes away, and we just have an awesome new innovation, industrial base. Question?
Jerry Henderson from the Sabripour Institute out of Indianapolis, a think tank down there. One of my question for this is, you've been describing sort of a new ecosystem that's emerging, and to me it all seems synergistic. So everything that we're talking about, a leap ahead with AI and unmanned, has a lot of overlap with what you're doing. Hypersonics has been playing into space and maneuverability. Are you seeing this synergy emerge as we're looking at these new leap ahead capabilities, things that are going to change the game, the face of war in many ways, in the way that precision guidance and stealth did in the late 1970s, early 1980s? Are you seeing this opportunity emerging, and are we properly positioned to get that leap ahead advantage in this growing great power competition between us and China?
So I'll give a quick answer from the Silicon Valley Defense Group kind of formal policy stance. The answer is yes and no. You use the word ecosystem. Our foundational concept is something we call emerging tech readiness. And our starting point is we know we need what you just said, which is some new emerging tech quickly to give us an edge. But if we're honest with ourselves, before the bad stuff happens, we don't exactly know what that is. And I would argue in the war on terror, the day before 9/11 versus the day after, we didn't know we needed mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles. And there's probably 100 other things we didn't know that we needed the next day. Same with Russia and Ukraine. We kind of knew we needed commercial overhead SIGINT gathering devices that we could share non-class information with our allies. Well, we really didn't know how much we needed them until Russia marched in. So our goal is to build an ecosystem that is adaptable, ready to move out, has the right people that are already connected with the tools from Congress. So when the bad stuff happens the next day, when we really, really know what we need overnight, we can go get it.
Yeah, I think one thing that I wanted to point out is what's changing. At least SDA's mission, Space Development Agency's mission, is to me very powerful. I'm a huge admirer of what Space Development Agency is doing, as well as other initiatives such as the DIU, Defense Innovation Unit. To me, this is really the defense acquisition reform that we've been waiting for. I mean, I think what SDA is doing amazing. Of course, they're a customer of ours. I'm very honored that we can serve them. But I think being able to be on a cadence of every couple of years, whether you make it or not, we're going to launch a distributed set of satellites in orbit and change the acquisition to be able to have small companies like mine participate is game-changing. It is game-changing. You know, innovation does really happen at small companies. People ask me all the time, how did you make progress with 100 people so fast and are building these sophisticated systems? And it must be the startup mentality or something. Maybe it is, but I don't think it's just a startup mentality. When I was at Lockheed, we had incredible engineers, incredible people. Of course, they're smart. We're not any smarter at startups. We're just same people. The reason innovation didn't happen as fast when I was at Lockheed is because I had a very large group of engineers, and several hundred engineers of all sorts, incredible people. But you see, innovation doesn't happen as fast because when a company like Lockheed wins a GPS-3 program or advanced EHF or space-based infrared system, and these are multi-billion-dollar programs, pretty much all the engineers who are working on R&D disappear into these programs behind closed doors for about 5 years. So 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. So every year, even though I had a huge budget of R&D, I couldn't spend it. Every October, every September, I had to start seeing what I can do to spend the R&D money. At a small company, we're focused on one thing. The reason my company is successful is because when we started, we had one job: to build an amazing phased array and make it available to our customers. It took 6.5 years of focus. You need every field of electrical engineering and mechanical engineering and aerospace to make something like this happen. But it was the focus that allowed us to get this technology ready for the warfighter. It isn't that Lockheed can't do it or Raytheon can't do it. Of course they can do it. It's just that the focus might not be the same. And I think it is really important that this new method of defense acquisition funds and gives us opportunities, 6.3, 6.4 type of money to companies like ours, because it is our focus that, to answer the gentleman's question, allows this technology to get in the hands of the warfighter as soon as possible.
Yeah, similar to James, my answer to you is like, are we taking advantage of these sort of national security breakthrough technologies fully? Yes and no. I would make the argument that the United States in the past decade has had the biggest sort of breakthrough or leap in a national security technology, which is we have rockets that launch and land every 3.5 days this year from Cape Canaveral. Having that type of capability, both that cadence, that cost, in order to be able to do any type of space awareness, national security satellites, be able to react to any of our adversaries' move in space, is a massive, massive advantage. But let's dissect basically why did that happen, right? Ultimately, it came from a very small startup. And what did that startup do very uniquely differently than groups like ULA or Boeing or anybody else that was sort of thinking about space launch? They ultimately were fundamentally a product company that went as full stack as they needed to. Where there were things that were commercially available off the shelf, for sure they bought them. But if you look at SpaceX, everything else that basically wasn't available commercial off the shelf, rather than trying to distribute it to a lot of suppliers, they built fully in-house, controlled themselves so that they can control their costs, control their cadence, and can control the ultimate product that they were delivering. Now, it took a long time for the DoD and for NASA to actually appreciate this approach and be willing to get behind them. But once they did, the entire United States has been able to benefit tremendously from this. If you look at that approach and how they develop their products and their technology, it could not be more opposite than effectively how the primes and the large, basically, defense players think about developing technology today. They, as much as possible, try to outsource many parts of their supply chain, even if it's not something that is commercially available off the shelf, to others, so that they develop one-off bespoke things that are necessary for that prime supply chain. Now, all of a sudden, that prime is no longer in control of their primary input into their cost, their cadence, their schedule. And they aren't necessarily thinking about things that are commercially off the shelf available. And so I would argue that, yes, in some ways we are taking advantage of it. No, in other ways we are not. And then if you even look at sort of the ways that DoD thinks about acquisitions today and the way they think about wargaming, it's sort of the same thing where they're sort of developing these RFPs that are so darn specific that you effectively have the particular solution laid out without a chance for commercial companies to come to you and try to pitch you effectively on a solution. So I think you need to start to see that shift in those RFPs. But at the same time, you are starting to see the DoD thinking about wargaming with commercial off-the-shelf technologies or supporting groups like SpaceX and others that are taking this product-first approach. So I think the answer is yes and no. There are some really great positive signs. Innovators like Elon have really pushed the way forward. But in some ways, I hope we further lean into that approach as opposed to continuing to aggregate, sort of more and more around the way that the primes approach it today.
Yep. Yes and no. Can always give room to do better. We got about 2 or 3 minutes left, so let's do a lightning round question.
Morning, gentlemen. Richard Lauer with the City of New Haven, and also a retiring Sergeant First Class in the U.S. Army. So first, to that last point, Shey, thank you for realizing that I probably want something a little bit newer than 40 years old. Funny story, a mechanized infantry company that I won't name here today. As I was deploying for Operation Iraqi Freedom back in '03, one of my soldiers found a M113 shell that his father drove in Vietnam. So I can definitely appreciate your point. But then to everyone on the panel, as a member of the City of New Haven staff, what can cities in the area be doing to become places where you would want to call home, possibly build facilities?
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for putting the closing comment up on the tee for me so I could hit it. We had a great conversation with Jim last night about this. There's 5 things an ecosystem needs to thrive for what we do. So dual-use defense tech, you need the brains, you need the money, you need the uniformed users, which I see sitting right here in front of me, you need industrial base, and you need leadership. You guys have it all. Now it's just about blocking and tackling and executing. You got the money sitting on the stage. Jim is building these relationships to the pockets of money. I've seen more in military-industrial complex in this room than I've seen in Silicon Valley in 25 years. You got us beat right there. You've got deep ties to the military. You've got the culture is totally bought in, right? Engineering, national security matters. So the talent's here. I think everything's here. You just got to go compete. So my recommendation last night, go baseline what Texas and Tennessee do. When they go courts, venture-backed hardware startups to come to them, see what they do, and do it better. And you can win and compete. You're not lacking anything. I think as you've got the vision and the leadership, you guys can go out and compete and win. So I'm actually pretty bullish on Indiana, Northern Indiana, Purdue. And I think you heard from these guys. I think they'll be doing more business out here with y'all as well. So I hopefully that's encouraging. We'll be continuing these conversations down the road. And thank you very much for the opportunity to chat with you today.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you, everybody.